we need to be able to go down and do that work. And then we need to come up and make art and do yoga and, dance and have movement and go out in nature and take a walk and play with pets and, commune with each other. So I think it's important. And if you will, you can say, okay, well, some of that is spiritual bypassing, but if you're doing it on purpose, you can do deep trauma work, and then you can go bliss hunting, and then you come back and do another deep dive, and then you can have another hit of bliss. And I think if we can balance it out that way, we can kind of have both. But as long as we're doing the deep dive, we're not skipping it. We're just maybe doing it in manageable bits.
Well, welcome everyone. We are so glad you're joining us for our podcast, The Aliveness Project, Conversations on Connection, hosted by the NARM Training Institute. And today we have the privilege of hearing from two leaders in the field of developmental and complex trauma, Dr. Laurence Heller and Dr. Lissa Rankin. My name is Iris McAlpin Garrett. I am a NARM master therapist in Northern California, and I'm your host for today's conversation. Today, Lissa and Larry will be exploring themes around healing from developmental trauma, what it means to provide comprehensive trauma-informed care, and the role of spirituality in the healing process. We hope this conversation offers valuable insights for anyone interested in going deeper into the process of healing from trauma. To everyone who is watching and listening, thank you so much for being here. And let's get started. Lissa Rankin, MD, is an OB-GYN physician, author of 7 books, founder of the Whole Health Medicine Institute, and the nonprofit Heal at Last. She's an enthusiastic artist who researches radical remission, trauma-informed medicine, and spiritual healing. She teaches memoir writing for therapeutic purposes, in addition to being an educator of internal family systems, IFS. Her TEDx talks have been viewed over 6 million times, and she starred in 2 national public television specials. Lissa is currently co-writing her 8th book with Harvard psychiatrist Dr. Jeffrey Rediger about the link between relational trauma and medical illness, focusing on how healthy boundaries and IFS therapy can help reverse diseases related to nervous system dysregulation caused by traumatizing relationships. Lissa lives with her partner, Jeff Rediger, in Sonoma County now that her daughter, Mira, has just left her with an empty nest. She thrives on daily hikes in nature, dancing, singing, writing, DJing music wherever she can, playing with her dog, Gaia, and healthy gourmet cooking. Welcome, Lissa. We also have Dr. Laurence Heller, who's the creator of the neuroaffective relational model, NARM, founder of the NARM Training Institute, international trainer and co-author of Healing Developmental Trauma, now published in 15 different languages. Dr. Heller has a PhD in clinical psychology and has conducted NARM trainings and case consultations for thousands of therapists throughout the United States and Europe. So welcome, Larry. So Lissa, could we begin just by you telling us a little bit about your journey and how you started doing the work that you're doing now?
Oh gosh, it's such a long story. I wrote a whole book about it called The Anatomy of a Calling, because I never intended to end up here. It certainly wasn't an on-purpose decision. I was raised with a physician father, a very conventional, traditional sort of scientific materialist father, and a very fundamentalist Christian mother, and never the twain shall meet. And so, finding myself sort of in this mind, body, spirit intersection has been a wild journey that, started with me going to medical school, fully indoctrinated into the Northwestern way, which was, certainly superior to the Harvard way or, the Yale way. And I practiced as an OB-GYN for 8 years in San Diego at Sharp Mary Birch Women's Hospital. But it was very quickly apparent to me that, my ideals for being a healer and, working with women and being able to be this sort of healing presence were extremely difficult. When I was starting my job, I was expected to see 25 patients a day. And by the time I quit, I was expected to see 40 patients a day. And if you do the math, that's like 2 patients in 15 minutes. And there was all this pressure because reimbursements were going down and, all of the insurance and overhead and all of that. So the business of medicine was really difficult. I was experiencing a lot of moral injury because, certainly doctors, every doctor that I know cares about patients, but the system itself gives lip service to patient well-being while ultimately being at the mercy of the financial bottom line. And doctors kind of feel like victims of the system. I've been working with doctors now for 15 years and doing trauma healing with doctors. Larry actually came in to work with some of our doctors at one point. So I care a lot about the doctors and I advocate for the doctors, but they often don't have a lot of power in the system. And so I felt helpless, hopeless, powerless, disempowered, and really out of touch with my calling. Like I felt hamstrung to be able to do the kind of healing work that I wanted to do. And I actually got quite suicidal from the moral injury. I look back now and I have a lot more insight into my 36-year-old self, sort of, being able to have some compassion for the grandiose parts of me that thought that I could be this great healer, and then reconciling the reality checking of the business that I had chosen to be in, and the the cognitive dissonance around that was really intolerable for my system at the time. So I ended up quitting, which was really hard. I was the full-time breadwinner in our family. I had a newborn baby. My baby's dad had just cut 2 fingers off his left hand with a table saw. My father had died 2 weeks after my daughter was born. My brother was in full-blown liver failure as a side effect from an antibiotic he was taking for a sinus infection. All hell was breaking loose in my life. And I just left. I just left, sold my house, liquidated my retirement account, and had no idea what I was going to do next. And 9 months later, I wound up at Esalen Institute, which began a connection with Rachel Naomi Remen, who's been my mentor since that time. She's an 87-year-old doctor who works with doctors, including in our circle, Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General under Obama and also Biden. So she's been running sort of spiritual healing, trauma healing, finding meaning in medicine groups for doctors. And I was lucky enough to get sort of swept under that wing. But she was one of those pioneers in mind-body medicine. Coming from Stanford back in the 60s, she was invited to Esalen Institute in 1962. If you know anything about Esalen Institute, that was like the heyday of the human potential movement. And it ended up with her leaving leaving Stanford and starting the Healer's Art at UCSF, which Vivek Murthy, as a young medical student, was coming from Yale to take this class, brought it to Yale, and now it's in something like 70 medical schools in, I think, 8 countries. So that's my lineage. And, I'm so grateful that I was sort of brought into that world, because I knew nothing about people like Bernie Siegel or Andy Weil or Rachel Remen, or, there was this whole renaissance of doctors that were exploring the edges of mind, body, spirit, in the 80s. And I was absolutely unfamiliar with that. Nobody ever talked to me about any of these things in medical school. So it was a complete re-education. I felt like I was going to grad school all over again to just try to catch up with everything in medicine that I was not taught in medical school. So I ended up I've written 8 books. My 3rd book was Mind Over Medicine, which I had done 2 TED Talks before that book. And then that book led to 2 PBS specials and working with doctors. And again, it's been a continuing education that began with Mind Over Medicine. And then part 2 of that book was originally supposed to be sort of everything subjective, like everything. Part 1 was everything science can prove. And part 2 was everything else, everything science doesn't know how to measure. And that ultimately became a book called Sacred Medicine, which is where I landed on Larry's work and Dick Schwartz's work and Gabor Mate's work and Bessel van der Kolk's work and Peter Levine's work. And that was sort of my gateway into trauma healing as medical treatment.
There's already so much to unpack there, but I'm curious how you two met, because you know each other already, you and Larry. I'd love to hear
I'm
that
actually
story.
trying to remember, Lissa. I
Yeah,
can't
you
remember.
know, I was exposed to your work through Emma Harper, who was exposed to your work in one of her therapy trainings. She's my parts processing partner, my IFS parts processing partner. And so I read Healing Developmental Trauma, was already an IFS practitioner. And I just thought the two married so beautifully. It was almost like, the survival styles from NARM were like a map of parts of different survival strategies, of different protector parts and exiles. So the marriage of that was really, really helpful to me in my own recovery. And then I think I reached out to you, Larry, to invite you to come and work with the doctors in the Whole Health Medicine Institute. You did a wonderful demo with one of our medical students, and I really was appreciating being able to talk about the medical aspects of this kind of healing work.
As you reminded me, then it all started kind of coming back to me. But I do remember now very clearly that both the demo and presenting it in the front with this very involved and engaged group of doctors.
Yeah, they're so excited. I mean, there's a lot of us out there. There's a lot of doctors, especially some of the younger ones who are really open to this kind of thing. I think when Rachel was a doctor like that, the resistance to the kind of work that Rachel was doing was so high in her age group. She was the only female in her medical school class at Cornell. But by the time I came through, there's so much more openness, and I'm seeing these young doctors now are just really hungry for this kind of material, and so much less resistance than even I experienced.
Yeah. So, Lissa, something you shared that made me really curious. I'm curious to hear from you, sort of personally, and from both of you more broadly, because you described a really difficult time period in your life, a lot of loss, a lot of significant change. And you went from that place to then going on to do so many incredible things. And, that's not true for everyone. Some people go through this dark time period and kind of get sucked under the current. And what do you think allowed you to move through that into this place where you're thriving, and maybe some discussion of why some people get stuck?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of in another phase of that now. So I'm like, am I thriving? um, my daughter, I have a brand new empty nest, and at the same time as my daughter moving on, and because of that, my housemate, who I've lived with for 13 years, she decided to move back home to New Hampshire. So I lost my daughter in the house and Taya in the house. And my daughter's father lived next door to me since our divorce 12 years ago, and he moved to Portugal. And at least I was going to get to keep my house. And then my landlord, who's a billionaire, decided to decided to turn my house into part of a corporate retreat center. So he asked me to move out. And there's no other place to live in Muir Beach. And I'm really embedded in my community. Like, I know Muir Beach. I know the land. I know all the plants. I know the cycles. I know the animals. I know the people. I knew my house. I had experienced this whole life, raised my daughter there. So to lose my house and my community and my family, and my partner Jeff recently moved in with me a year ago, but we were planning on settling in Muir Beach. And so I feel really displaced now. That was not how I was feeling back then. I would say back then, I mean, to be honest, my coping strategy was spiritual bypassing. And so I look back with some nostalgia on that time, because it was actually quite magical. It was quite, there was a tremendous amount of synchronicity. There were a tremendous amount of like mysterious, magical, mystical kinds of things that were happening that helped me to cope with all of that. And I'm really grateful for that phase. And it was very inflating. I felt very special because of it. And so, as any grandiosity can have happened, there was then the fall from the crash from that several years later. That was quite difficult, but also good timing, because that was really the beginning. I thought I was in a recovery phase during those years of spiritual bypassing, because I was working really hard on myself. I was taking a lot of workshops. I was working with a lot of therapists. I was doing a lot of inner work, but it was not the deeper shadow work. It was not the more honest, those deeper layers of healing that we experience as life happens, right? So, it's one thing when you're working on the parts of yourself that feel victimized, that feel hurt, that feel lost or are grieving. And it's much more difficult when you get to the phase of your recovery where you're like, oh shit, I am the perpetrator of some of these very things that have happened to me. Obviously not the random losses, but some of the relational patterns, for example. So yeah, it's been quite a journey. And people ask me sometimes, I think the question you're sort of asking is like, how did you not just collapse under the weight of that? And as I said, part of the answer is grandiosity, spiritual bypassing. But part of the answer I think also is a testament to the relative lack of trauma in my early life. I had sort of the developmental trauma of the perfectionistic, narcissistic, fundamentalist mother. But I didn't experience a lot of the things that many of the people that I work with experience. And so I always had kind of I guess in IFS, we would say one of the C's of self, of the 8 C's of self, is confidence. And I always kind of had this sense that no matter what happened, I would land butter side up, that I could take risks and somehow I would be supported in doing so. I now realize that a lot of the support that I got was a result of a lot of unearned privilege. So I no longer take it so personally or think that I'm special because of that. And I think a lot of people without as many unearned privileges as I have might not have had it turn out so good. And that I don't see as some strength of my own, more so the random luck of being born, white, cis, hetero, able-bodied, socioeconomically privileged, all of that.
Lissa, you mentioned somebody who you said kind of developed this term.
John Wellwood developed that term as a way of the term spiritual bypassing, as a way of describing people who are using their spiritual practices to avoid unprocessed childhood wounds, unmet needs, unmetabolized difficult emotions. And Robert Augustus Masters wrote the book Spiritual Bypassing, inspired by John Wellwood's work on spiritual bypassing. And he defines it. I love his definition because it's so simple. He defines it as conflict avoidance in holy drag. Which, like, that really resonated with me because I look back on those days and I was definitely avoiding conflict, like especially relationally, right? This was my neurotic tolerance and naive compassion. What in the name of unconditional love was actually my terror of confronting people who were mistreating me and using my spiritual beliefs to justify that was the right thing to do. So not only does it prevent us from, for example, protesting mistreatment, we come to think, oh, a spiritual person doesn't get angry. A spiritual person doesn't hold their boundaries. A spiritual person is open and receptive, right? A spiritual, whatever, all the ideas that we develop of what is and is not a spiritual person. And you mix that with the premature transcendence and sort of the bliss hunting, and you get a whole strategy, in IFS, we call it self-like parts that mimic self. But they're actually a protector part. They're a way of continuing to bypass the exiles, the helpless, hopeless, despairing, tender, worthless, unlovable, discarded, disposable, abandoned. Those really tender exile feelings are so intolerable to our system that we just have to meditate longer now, and we just have to do another yoga class. We have to go to another tantra workshop, and then we've got to, do another kirtan and do more chanting. And so you notice that just like with any addiction, these strategies ramp up. And, people are not functioning very well in their professional life or in their family life because they're so busy trying to suppress all of those difficult feelings. And of course, you go to a meditation retreat, people lose their shit. They're sobbing, they're raging, they're having psychotic episodes. Um, because sitting in silence without the tools, without the trauma healing tools that we now know, and we have them, we have developed them. So the way I described it in sacred medicine, I use the metaphor of being like whales. I live by the coast and we get to see the whales. And the whales, when they go deep, that's where they travel. They go deep, they make a lot of progress, they can go really fast. That's what I think of as the deep trauma work, right? We go deep, we can make progress, but we can't stay down there forever. They come back up. They have to blow their blowholes, and then they play. They smack their tails. They put their bodies up and they body slam the water. You ask these biologists why they do that. Is it mating behavior? Is it feeding? No, they're just having fun. And so I feel like, when I did my first workshop with Dick Schwartz, I was like, oh my God, Dick, I can't sit on the floor on a back jack and do trauma work for 12 hours straight. Like, we need to be able to go down and do that work. And then we need to come up and make art and do yoga and, dance and have movement and go out in nature and take a walk and play with pets and, commune with each other. So I think it's important. And if you will, you can say, okay, well, some of that is spiritual bypassing, but if you're doing it on purpose, you can do deep trauma work and then you can go bliss hunting and then you come back and do another deep dive and then you can have another hit of bliss. And I think if we can balance it out that way, we can kind of have both. But as long as we're doing the deep dive, we're not skipping it. We're just maybe doing it in manageable bits.
I've used that word. It's not like an everyday word that I use. But I didn't know where it came from, and I don't even remember when I started first using it. So I don't know how old these books are, but in my work, I talk about the various adaptive survival styles. The first one being the connection survival style, and I've always talked about the two subtypes: the thinking subtype and the spiritualizing subtype. And what I came to see is that for some people, that was their only available mechanism. So that people who are the thinking subtypes, they tend to be disconnected from their body and emotions, very much in their heads. But then I've also worked with these individuals who are the spiritualizing subtypes, and they were literally completely out of their body and living in the energetic field. And as I always teach when I teach about that, and that doesn't mean that they're not really feeling some or experiencing some things that are real, but they're using them in a way, just as you described, to not deal with other aspects of life. They feel safer and more comfortable out there in the energetic field rather than in their body with another person. And so it became their go-to very early survival orientation, their coping mechanism. And that's a little more difficult than to deal with, and it takes more time. If you need a little more, it's more challenging if they've never had the experience of embodiment in any way, which is some people's experience when they have the earliest kinds of trauma. It's not like I'm working with a vet who has PTSD and very dissociated but had the experience previously of being a body and being in a body, that if you've never had that, it's so frightening to start to reconnect to your emotions and to your body. And because it is our deepest longing, we all want to be connected to something greater than ourselves. I believe, at least on some level, whether people realize it or not. But we also want to be connected here to ourselves and to a significant other and to a greater community. And, these individuals face a lot of challenges because they feel other people are seen as a threat.
Absolutely.
And yeah,
I just wanted to add that those spiritualized subtypes of the connection survival style often find solace, not only solace, but a sense of specialness in spiritual communities, because these spiritual gifts are seen as maybe a mark of enlightenment. You're an old soul. You're more in touch with God or the angels or the spirit guides or the ancestors. And so this thing that maybe in different circles, they feel strange, they feel disconnected, they feel odd. Other people don't understand them. They think they're going crazy. And then they wind up in a spiritual circle and it's like, no, you're a guru. No, you're a channeler. No, you're a medium connecting with the ancestors. And so they can actually wind up with a tremendous amount of grandiosity, and other people can actually put them on pedestals. And all of a sudden their trauma is now lauded. Their trauma symptom is now spiritualized as a special gift, which it is, and it's a trauma symptom that needs treatment. And often when they do the embodiment work, sometimes they lose access to that, but then they gain something so much more beautiful, which is the ability to connect with other humans, the ability to be in a body, the ability to be here and communicating with nature and on this planet in this time and space. So I've really appreciated your work around my work with people who are in recovery from spiritual communities, because it's such a helpful framework for people to understand those experiences and those gifts in a very validating and confirming way, but also not a grandiose or, making it something special, rather making it something that needs treatment.
Yeah, you spoke about this a little bit in your book, and you just touched on it now, this idea of premature transcendence, where you think you're here in your healing journey and maybe you're, a couple steps behind. It just speaks to, how layered our minds are. We really can be convinced that, we're in a different place than we actually are. She was talking about spiritual bypassing and, that there was a period where she thought she was further along in her process than she was. And she talks about this in sacred medicine as this concept of premature transcendence, and that this happens in spiritual circles a lot.
that wasn't my path. My, for a variety of reasons, and again, some of it certainly unearned, but I'm very physical. And it's one of the ways that I've always managed, in my life, not and thrived in a certain way. I've done growing up in Colorado. I've done sports. I started skiing very early. Started competitive swimming. I started doing all those things. And again, there's privilege in even having those possibilities, but that physicality has been really important. And kind of my family's biggest trauma, and which includes me, was actually a chronic but also intermittent medical problem that my father had, where he was okay for a couple of years, but it was always just a matter of time until some other piece came up. And so that was that. And I was fortunate to have really a very supportive and, you know, loving mother who did the best she could and really did well. But having this ill father took a lot of the oxygen out of the family. And one of the things the way that I coped was to be outside. That was back in the day when kids could still run free and have be close to nature and do all these things and be gone until dark, and nobody would be calling social services, all this stuff, which I didn't even realize at the time was such a special gift that I received. But so really in terms of first I just was fascinated. I was in a whole different field, as many of my students know. I was in languages and linguistics, and I was working on a PhD. And I came back to Boulder, and I went to a Gestalt, presentation, and I was immediately fascinated. And then we started doing these encounter groups, and there was a place where people talked about feelings and emotions, and this is like I was just immediately drawn to it. And I saw this movie. This is not really important, but I thought in the movie there was a Gestalt therapist who was. It was actually kind of a comedy, but I thought it planted the idea that I would love to do some Gestalt therapy, and I was still at that point planning on going back to the University of Michigan and finishing my PhD there. And but I started in this summer. I started first the things that I mentioned, and then I found this Gestalt therapist, and I hadn't, I think one of the first words that I said to this guy was, I don't think I've cried in like 10 or 15 years or even longer. And then 5 minutes later, I was crying, and I was dealing with some of the issues of loss and loneliness, of really not having the supportive, loving father that, that I needed and that I wanted, and that people tend to need. So, and I was absolutely hooked from the very beginning. And to kind of make a long story short, then I went back and did traditional training, but very early on, I got involved in some of the more, it was the later part of the human potential movement, but it was still going on. And there was Gestalt, and then there was also bioenergetics and various neo-Reichian approaches. And I just fell in love with all this stuff. Anything that helped me feel more, connected, that, gave me a different perspective on me and my life and other people and all of those things. So I was just drawn to this whole dynamic. And then it was very clear to me very early on that what I had been learning, which was more kind of a psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, that it was flat, and it was too mental. And there was I look, and I'm in a very different place now, but the early body-oriented work that I did was, again, fit with my physicality, but also fit with me just personally and emotionally. I just loved it. And I looked back later and saw that a lot of people were actually being hurt by some of this cathartic, regressive work. But at the time, for me, it was really helpful, although I did see other people, and I didn't have the sophistication at that time to know that there were some people who were really injured by this work. But it, and so when I started developing NARM, which is long before I had the name, I drew on both what I found helpful, but also what I found and observed was hurtful to people. And so I got away from the pathologizing that I had learned, in graduate school studying psychology. I got away from seeing people through this pathological lens. It's one step to not focus so much on diagnoses, but it's another step to really free ourselves as practitioners from this whole orientation of that, of seeing, just focusing on what's quote unquote wrong with somebody. Mm-hmm. And this whole orientation, and it just started, something started to cook in me. And out of that, I wrote my first book, which was never published. I got off on a different path, but it was actually the beginning of NARM. I could only see that later on. And then, and I tried to incorporate all kinds of things that I learned, not just doing body work and psychological work, but then I did start exploring, and I was kind of anti-spiritual at one point, not anymore, as probably Iris, because you've seen me teach. But at one point, I considered myself at best an agnostic. And then in some of the training groups I've shared that I did this fourth chakra work with this person who was actually a rolfer at our institute, and I wasn't expecting very much. And, so I'm kind of moving to the spiritual thing, because that was my introduction. We did this fourth chakra work. It was breath work that was focusing on the fourth chakra. And in about 45 minutes, for me, it was like the universe split open, and I experience myself as a dot of light connected to all these billions of other dots of light in this huge web. And I've had a direct experience that this web was, every molecule of this web was love. And so this was like completely out of my paradigm, this, and, and I, it changed my life. And I've not ever seen this guy since. So I've never had the opportunity to tell him. Maybe he'll see this and he'll remember the work that we did together. I know he's still around someplace because I've seen his name, but, that was the beginning of my spiritual work. So and I don't think at that point, because I'd already done a lot of personal work, that I used spiritual bypass, which is really what your question was. But I came to recognize it in a lot of people, and I came to see that, that we can't avoid the emotional work and we can't avoid the other levels of work, and that there is also a very real spiritual dimension that we all have access to. If we're fortunate enough or whatever, do the work and whatever combination of elements go into accessing, the deeper truths that really are present in so many different spiritual systems. So.
See, Larry, I was having experiences like that all the time around the timing of my father's death. And then, going through my Esalen experience and years after that. But I remember, in answer to your question, Iris, it was 2013, and it was the 4th of July, and I was at a 4th of July party. And again, talk about grandiosity. I had just gone through a horrible relationship with somebody extremely narcissistic and not doing their healing work. And I had been tolerating and tolerating and tolerating, to use Robert Augustus Masters, the one who wrote the book Spiritual Bypassing, to use his language, neurotic tolerance, blind compassion, or I like to call it naive compassion, so as not to insult blind people. But I had made the story that I deserved a PhD in unconditional love. I had figured out how to love the most intolerable asshats on the planet, without standing up for myself, without boundaries, without accountability, without protesting. And so that's what I mean in the premature transcendence. Like, I thought I am at the top of the mountain, and it was 4th of July, and I had this like dawning insight that hit like a lightning bolt that was like, okay, if there's such a thing as unconditional love for other people, okay, great, you're there. But when it comes to unconditional love for yourself, you're in kindergarten. You have no idea how to protect yourself, how to stand up for yourself. You're back at the bottom of the mountain. Like, if there's a mountain, you're only halfway there, if that. And if otherwise, or you're at the very bottom again, starting over. And it was absolutely true and shattering for my grandiosity. But the timing was beautiful. So again, moments of synchronicity, because my cousin, Rebecca Ching, had just studied with Dick Schwartz for the first time. And I was on my Mind Over Medicine book tour, and she said, you've got to check out this IFS thing. And it was the perfect antidote. It was like the most gentle off ramp to be able to, like, that was the how. It was like, well, how do I unconditionally love my own parts the way I've unconditionally loved really difficult to love people? How can I love the really difficult to love parts of myself in that same way? And all of a sudden there was a roadmap here. So it was a beautiful transition for me, because I think of IFS as a spiritual path. I think Dick Schwartz and I taught a class called Spirituality Without Bypassing. And he's teaching another class coming up with Sounds True, about the spiritual aspects of IFS. And he also identified as an atheist. So you don't have to believe anything. It's like a byproduct of the process. Like, people have direct experience whether you believe in anything or not. So that was a really beautiful experience for me. I had been doing like 21-day meditation retreats, transcending my trauma. I was the opposite of you, Larry. I was looking for anything that made me not feel anything but bliss. I was bliss hunting, and again, quite happily bliss hunting for a while until the crash.
Yeah, this makes me interested because, Larry, you talked about how, in your path, you ran into people who were engaging in practices that maybe they thought were helping, but were ultimately harming them. And Lissa, you kind of touched on that as well. It's like, how do we know when something is really helping us heal, and what is real healing? I know that's kind of a big question, but what is real healing?
Well, there's a certain, and this again is a capacity that develops and can develop, but really listening to yourself, and that, again, that not always easy, particularly if we've grown up not listening to ourselves. But like, one of my teachers was Alexander Lowen, and though I learned a lot from him, and as a person, I thought he was interesting and great and vital and all of these things. But I knew at the very beginning that all of this breaking down of armoring that he was doing, I mean, it used to be painful stuff in the early days. And also standing naked in front of groups and having your various character structures analyzed, all this, this was just not right. And I knew it, and I listened to it. So I never continued. I learned some things from him, and then I moved on. And then, but I wasn't like a dilettante. I learned what I could, and I stayed for a while. But then I saw that there were things that I just didn't agree with, and there was an inherent brutality in some of what I was exposed to, particularly the way they would break down the armor. And then I was exposed to this incredible guy who's, I'm sure he'd be about 108 now, so I don't think he's still around. And he was the very first truly gentle man that I had ever met and worked with. And he had a big impact, even though I didn't spend a lot of time with him, but he was one of the most sweet and loving guys. And at the same time, very clear and straight and straightforward. So again, I found my path was just like, making serious commitments in different areas, but also trusting when something didn't feel right and listening to that. Where that came from, that may have been a part of one of the gifts from my mother, or it's hard for me to know exactly, but I feel like I did trust, my own sense of things, even like trusting that despite all the commitment I had given in to this other field, that it wasn't right for me, and I would act on it. I did act on it. And I did that in terms of various therapeutic and then spiritual processes too. Like, I was in a spiritual school for 12, 13 years. I learned a lot. I experienced a lot directly, but I also felt that some things were damaging to people and some things were just wrong. And at a certain point, I trusted myself, even though it was, by definition, it was always seen as resistance, and that the message was you're supposed to trust your teacher, and if you didn't, it was because of your own resistance. And totalitarian regimes of all kinds, including psychoanalysis, will always analyze your resistance as your problem and not ever look at what's going on, structurally in the whole dynamic. But I learned a lot, and I felt at a certain point it was painful that I wanted to move on. This was after many years, obviously, and again, it involved lots of meditation, deep and beautiful experiences which previously had been completely outside of my awareness. And so, I just kind of gathered things as I went, and as I started teaching, things just started on. What's the best word to use? It's like I just started seeing things. There was a certain kind of an unfoldment, and I found that I was teaching others, but I was also learning myself as I was teaching, and that this. And in a way, I I know this language always it could sound easily like spiritual bypass, but for me, I did really feel like I was just a certain kind of vessel for, this languaging gives me difficulty saying it on it. But I feel like in some ways it was just coming through me, this understanding, and it was informing me while I was teaching others, and things were developing as they went. And I just found my calling, and I feel like teaching has been my calling, and I love doing it. And here I am all these years later, and a few books later as well.
So the question was a big one. Like, what is healing? Are we?
Yeah. And how do we know when it's real versus, we're just convincing ourselves that we're healing? And Lissa, for you too, I'm curious to hear, because I know this is a topic you're really interested in, is, what is the role of love in healing? Because I heard Larry bring pieces of that into, when he was talking about this teacher who was gentle, like, why is love? Why is gentleness? Why is that important in healing?
Well, I think, one of the reasons I split up the books Mind Over Medicine and Sacred Medicine is because love is something you can't measure in a randomized controlled clinical trial. I don't understand at all how scientists think they can test a therapeutic healing model, for example. Because to me, if a loving, empathic, Julia Cameron calls it the believing mirror. If you have this wonderful presence with a trauma survivor or a sick person, I don't care what model they're practicing. They can be using NARM or CBT or IFS or somatic experiencing or my 6 steps to healing yourself or whatever. Their presence is going to be healing for the other person, period, regardless of the model. And there's no way to control for that. There's no way to say, well, let's get an unloving IFS practitioner and a loving IFS practitioner and a control who's not getting IFS, and we'll see how they do, right? There's no way to measure, is the therapist in self, right? Is the therapist loving? And so, in my opinion, like the science of therapy, psychotherapy in general is flawed from the beginning because you can't control for that. So, Larry, I know you teach people, you're one of the model builders, you train people to do NARM, and some of them are going to do it in a really loving, beautiful, healing way, and some of them are going to butcher it because they're caught up in their own power trip of controlling somebody vulnerable, and that's damaging. And that has nothing to do with NARM, right? That's about the individual and the way that they show up. So I think, that was one of the, for sacred medicine, I spent 10 years going around the world working with shamans in Peru and Qigong masters in China and Balinese healers and faith healers all over the world and going to places like Lourdes and retreat centers where they're treating cancer without conventional medicine. And that led me to the trauma healers, because when I was watching the energy healers, I was like, wait a minute. It looks like they're bringing up people's traumas. They're trying to hold a safe, loving, beautiful space, but they're not therapists. And many of them are, activating the traumas and then, in my opinion, not working with them safely. So that was kind of a gateway for me to go into the studying more about the trauma healing role. And whether we're talking about doctors or therapists or energy healers or shamans, one of the darkest things that I saw in all of that exploration of medical school and then my post-medical school experience in the mind-body field, and then working with energy healers and faith healers and spiritual healers, and then working with trauma healers, is that all of those have power and control issues that can be the shadow, right? I saw abuses of power in all of those realms, but they weren't equal. There was definitely more abuse of power in the unregulated fields of energy healing, shamanic healing, alternative medicine, without licensure, without board certification. You see it in the psychotherapy world, and you certainly see it in doctors as well, but at least they have licenses and boards. And if they are abusing their power or, violating medical ethics, people can turn them in and they can lose their license. So that was very revealing to me. And at the same time, those people give a bad name to the people in unregulated fields who are wonderful. And there are many of them. There are many that are wonderful, but the people who are not wonderful are more awful. because they're just completely without ethics, without boundaries. So I got to see the stark difference between like the true indigenous healers who are absolutely loving and doing the most incredible work outside of any, conventional medical or therapeutic graduate school, board certified, licensed professions. And that's very real. And then, again, there's just as many um, dangerous people in that world. And certainly as a cis white hetero female, like in California, I was very seduced by a lot of those people and experienced a lot of trauma at their hands. And even worse, had a lot of bystander trauma from watching other people that were vulnerable and feeling really helpless because these were people that were experiencing criminal violations and they wouldn't press charges, but they were all telling me their stories. So I definitely saw a lot of what healing wasn't. But one of the things that I really had a really wonderful experience with Chris Rutgers, who started the Trauma Foundation. I know, Larry, you know Chris as well, and I think he may have even been one of the people who originally put me in touch with you. And, Chris is a trauma survivor with an ACE score of 8 who's been very transparent about the abuses that he went through and, was a privileged guy who had plenty of money to spend on trauma therapy and tried everything. Like he literally talk about like a therapy, I don't know, what do you call a therapy adventurist? Like he really has tried and experimented with all kinds of things. And he's one of the smartest people I've ever met. He's not a therapist or a doctor, but he absolutely knows more about trauma and trauma healing than almost anybody that I know. And so one of the things that the two of us wound up doing, along with some other really wise people, is we tried to sit down and crowdsource, like what is healing and what does trauma healing require? And we kind of came up with these different buckets. And one of the things that I think was challenging and also illuminating is that a lot of people, and I found this in the mind body world, I found this in the energy healing world, and I found it in the trauma healing world too. A lot of the people who create these different healing models, they think my model is the model. It's the only model. It works for everybody. It's a panacea. If it's not working, it's because of the client or the practitioner isn't doing it right or something like that, which is weird to me as a doctor because like, at least in medicine, I'm not saying doctors aren't equally, delusional or arrogant, but at least we know like penicillin is great for strep throat, but it doesn't do shit for COVID. Not all medicines work for all people with all diseases at all times. And I found that especially in the trauma healing world, it's like, I'm really interested in like what medicines work when, at what phase of the healing journey, in what sequence, and how do we triage that? And I haven't found anybody who can answer that question. I know Bruce Perry has tried. That's part of my inquiry. And so Chris and I came up with, I have my little list here of just kind of 9 buckets. So I'll just read through them real quick and we can talk more deeply about them. So psychoeducation, understanding adaptive survival strategies, embodiment and somatic mindfulness, nervous system regulation, metabolizing implicit sensations, emotions, and memories, including the memory reconsolidation, resourcing and meaning making, treating negative core beliefs, installing new identity, and rewriting your story, and community. I said there were 9, there are 8. So that's been really exciting for me to just kind of start unpacking those and to explore different models that hit different boxes there. And some of those boxes get hit really well with spiritual communities, right? Like meaning making and community and things like that, but they don't necessarily like I never in any of the spiritual communities I was involved in, nobody was ever giving me psychoeducation about, for example, identifying narcissistic behaviors or how to set and hold appropriate boundaries or what relational repair requires. So one of the things that I've been doing now for the past year is running a relational skill building sort of psychoeducation community of practice called Love School for people who are kind of in that spiritual bypassing recovery in their relationships, whether they're single or partnered or such, because that was one of the things that really I didn't get taught. And my current partner, grew up in a cult, so he really didn't get taught any of those things. So yeah, that's a short answer.
Yeah, and those are the 8 things that you got from talking to a lot of different people about, what really makes healing possible.
Yeah, like I said, Chris Rutgers started some of that, and then we were having these monthly conference calls, and we were crowdsourcing this with people like Dick Schwartz and Peter Levine and Larry. I think we ran some of this by you, and Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk, and some of these other people in the field, and there's no consensus. Like I actually had grant funding at one point. I wanted to get all the model builders. Esalen was willing to donate space. I had philanthropic funding to get everybody together because I wanted everybody to like sit in a room together and like, let's hash it out. Let's talk about what does and doesn't work when, and what are the problems, and which models are contraindicated in certain situations, and all of that sort of thing. And I found that it was the siloing of nobody really the people that I wanted to talk to were not really getting cross-trained in each other's models. So, it's like they were thrilled. They were interested in coming and sharing, this is what I've learned, but there wasn't a lot of curiosity about, well, what has everybody else learned and how can we integrate these? How can we come up with a kind of comprehensive, integrative psychotherapy model that so that people who are coming from grad school don't have to take like 10 different trainings. But that ended up not really working out. And I finally just gave up trying to herd cats.
What is your sense of that? Because I've seen the same thing, just that people sort of fall into their camp, and then whether it's in medicine or whether it's in spirituality or in therapy, maybe it's a fear, maybe it's something else, but to expand, to accept other modalities, or just to broaden our possibility space of what could work.
Well, I know for me, I certainly am like an evangelist of IFS, and I'm not a purist. I mean, I just published a blog article that I co-wrote with Dick Schwartz and the CEO of the IFS Institute, Katie Nelson, because people were asking me, is IFS a cult? And I thought, that's an interesting question. Let's explore it as a community. Let's explore what is or isn't culty about any of our communities. Where do we get so much zealotry that we lose curiosity, or we lose critical thinking, or we lose the ability to spot the shadow in ourselves or in our leaders or in our communities, or maybe the flaws in our models? Or to me, that's really culty if we are not able to do that. So I was actually proud of all of us, because it was difficult for me to write that essay. I don't want to insult the very model that I evangelize. And I certainly didn't want to hurt Dick or Katie or any of the other people that I love in the IFS leadership. And at the same time, I thought it was a question that deserved an exploration. So I posted about it on Facebook, asked for crowdsourcing. There were hundreds of people who had an opinion about it. And then I was kind of trying to collate some of those things. And so I think there is a tendency, if you love something and it's helped you, to I don't know what's the word for it. It's easy to feel a sense of belonging, but that belonging often requires us to put aside critical thinking or to overlook certain things that are worrisome. And so to be able to, I don't know, have buy-in for something and still keep our critical thinking online, keep our skepticism on board, and recognize that something, just like you were saying, Larry, when you were, experiencing all of these human potential movement, Gestalt, and all of this, things can be both wonderful and hurtful. And I think for me, going back to the reason I left the hospital, I've now made a lot more peace with the fact that anytime you're wielding a scalpel, you can heal and you can kill. And I would say that's the same for psychotherapy. Like, we have a psychic scalpel. We can heal and we can harm. And for me, in my younger years, I couldn't handle that I was both helping and harming. And now I think we're delusional if we think we're not going to harm people that we try to help sometimes. Like, that's magical thinking. It's not possible. And to be able to hold the complexity and the nuance of, I am somebody who both helps and harms, and the best I can do is to try to be really humble and really available for feedback and really listening to my community. I think that's how we cult-proof our communities, is to, be available for criticism, be available for people to call out leadership and say, like, you're harming me, whether you intended to or not. Like, the microaggressions are hurting, or you're abusing your power in this way, or you're unaware of your unearned privilege. And my community definitely calls me out on those things.
Mm.
And I think that's good. But it's difficult to try to find right use of power with the humility of acknowledging that we wield the power to help and harm.
Well, in NARM, I've really, I resonate with the abuse of power. In NARM, I've worked really hard to make sure that, for one thing, that we are aware of the implicit power that we have as a therapist, but what goes on explicitly, for example, there are some things that we just don't do in NARM, which is we don't ever interpret, because that would be me telling you who you are or what you're feeling or what you're supposed to be feeling. And that's harming, no matter what system you're wedded to. And so I tried to see what are the underlying dynamics. And so part of this is that I never, and I make this an explicit part of the training, that our expertise is helping the client to become experts in their own internal world, in their own internal process. And I come back to that again and again. And it reduces the possibility, and from my perspective, it reduces the possibility of harm. I mean, nothing can completely eliminate it, but it's like, don't trust it unless you experience it. I don't say it that directly, but that's really where I'm coming from, is that you're ultimately, you being the client, are ultimately the expert in your own internal world. And I'm bringing curiosity and exploration, and we do that explicitly in NARM, bringing curiosity and exploration to their own process. And we're looking basically at what are the internal obstacles that they have developed that are getting in the way of what I consider one of the most fundamental aspects of healing, which is deep connection to self, connection to others, and connection to something greater than ourselves, for many people, not for everybody. And I don't ever push the spiritual element on people. So some people, it's not their path. It's not their way. So, but I also want to hold it out as a possibility for those people who are drawn in that direction. So for me, it's less about the technique than the major dynamic that I see going on with people is that we adapt to adverse childhood experience, for example, by disconnecting. And all of Anna Freud's, defense mechanisms, as I looked at them and tried to see what is the big picture here, I saw they were all just processes of ways of describing different ways that we disconnect from ourselves, from others, and from nature and from something greater than ourselves. And so we're exploring that connection disconnection dynamic, and that is the ongoing, like an ongoing. It's not one of the official 4 pillars, but it's the exploration is part of the 4 pillars, but it's not. But the connection disconnection is so fundamental and so basic to me that other things flow from there. Because when we're disconnected, we're dysregulated by definition because we're disconnected. And the body is the mechanism of disconnection by tension, collapse, and holding our breath, all the different things. And it can be, on a muscular level, it can be on a visceral level, it can be even on a cellular level. So, and by the fact that we don't interpret, that we just ask questions and we invite exploration on the client's part, we never tell them what they're feeling or what they're supposed to be feeling. That creates a certain kind of protection for the client, I think, in NARM, which, a lot of people have been drawn to NARM, I think, because they've been through various systems that are telling them what and how and who they're supposed to be. I think there is another bucket, and it's related to this, what you said. You did talk about identity, but for me, I would phrase it just slightly. Well, I remember you talked about identity, but for me, a very important part of the work that I teach and that I do is working with people's distortions of identity.
Mhm.
And so, and this is where, and Gabor Mate and I have had numerous conversations, and we talk some of the similar ways that we see things, and also the parts where Dick and I have been on a couple of podcasts together, and he and I have talked about, because we also talk about in NARM about accepting the various parts of ourselves.
Uh-huh.
Other than that, we don't use parts in the same way that you do in IFS, but I do see NARM as a path of acceptance, of learning to accept particularly the split off aspects, the split off parts of ourselves, the parts that we most dislike, the parts that we most want to avoid. And we don't push for that because we understand that and we don't use the word resistance ever in NARM, except to say that we don't use the word resistance.
Yeah,
Because
because resistance is just protect your parts. Like,
well, in IFS,
you just give them more power if you insult their job.
Yeah. And on another level, it's just fear.
Yeah.
So people are afraid. And one of the questions that we do is we just explore when people are what would be traditionally called resistant, is we say, I might ask the question, what's the scariest thing about whatever it is? For some people, it could be communicating their needs. For other people, it might be saying no to people that they love or setting limits with them. And then we just explore what the catastrophic fantasies are that they have are going to, and that takes us back to this fundamental, what we call in NARM, the core dilemma, to be having authenticity versus attachment, or authenticity versus love. Because a lot of times baked into so many of us is the idea that if we show up truly as ourselves, we're not going to be loved. Right. We're going to lose, and ultimately, historically in childhood, losing the attachment relationships. So we work with that dilemma, and another thing that I teach in the model is that as NARM therapists, we never take sides in an internal dilemma that a client is experiencing. It's unfair, it's disrespectful, and it's inappropriate. And I'm really strong about this because most of us have multiple internal conflicts.
Sure.
And how are we to know as therapists for that person what they're supposed to do? It's like, there's a certain humility for us as therapists. I don't know what's right for you. I don't know if you should stay in this relationship or leave, but I will explore with you what the various pros and cons inside you are about. And then ultimately, I don't give advice. And that's the other piece that's very important in NARM, is that we don't give advice. And some people might feel, well, some people want advice, rightly or wrongly, but we trust that they will, given the sufficient internal information from their own selves, and sometimes psychoeducation, just external information, generalized, not to them personally, but what they can, talking about certain kind of, in a very brief way, not too cognitive, but some certain principles that they can then select what fits for them. What makes sense to them, what helps them. They get to choose that. So I might say, well, some people do this and then, or have this reaction, and then I leave it up to them to decide how they're going to relate to that. So some people think we just follow in NARM, which isn't true, but we definitely don't forge ahead and we don't work harder than the client. We're supporting them in their own capacity, their own agency, their own ability to know what's right for themselves. So that's, again, obviously you can see how that some of that relates to my own history, and it's inevitable that parts of, our own predilections come into any model that we develop. And yet a lot of people feel respected by that and feel the gentleness in that. And again, so central for me in all the work that I do and in the way I teach is coming back to the heart, and for people to that reconnection with the heart, which again was as we've heard here, was an important step in my growth. But I just find it so central, and there are some people who are not drawn so much in that direction, but so they're like, there could be more mental approaches like Buddhism. So for some people, it's more about emptiness, and I'm fine with that. That's how they experience it. And other traditions emphasize more, devotional and heart oriented. And again, it's always left up to the client. What draws them? What is their natural movement? Because my mantra, it's been on every book, and I start every training pretty much with this, is that the spontaneous movement in all of us is towards connection. And it's just our job to explore the learned obstacles that are now in the way of the deep connection that I believe we all want, whether it's connection to self, to others, both, or something greater. So that's kind of my orientation to this, but I really did relate to the abusive power dynamic, because I am so sensitive to that. Again, I'm sure for personal reasons on some level, but also just in terms of clinical reasons, I just don't think it's useful.
Can I ask you a clarifying question? I'm so interested in what you're talking about, and you and I haven't had too much time to really dive into some of these things. But you said, we don't take sides in an individual's inner polarization. And that, from an individual healing perspective, like, that makes so much sense, right? We need to let the client resolve their inner polarizations on their own and mediate and be the self energy, or the wise, mature adult, or the inner healer, or whatever, to work with those different strategies, or different behavioral patterns on their own. And I know my partner and we got in couples therapy before we ever had sex because of his significant trauma, and it was clear that we were going to need a lot of help, because of the significant distrust that he had of human beings in general, and me in particular. And so we were doing our individual therapy, and it was really interesting, because our individual therapy was personally empowering us as individuals, and it was actually it was almost making our partnership worse. And so we switched. We were both working with individual IFS therapists and an IFS couples therapist, doing IFIO, they call it, is the IFS version of intimacy from the inside out. That didn't work for us at all, because nobody was taking sides. Nobody took sides. Nobody ever said to either one of us, what you're doing is wrong and hurtful. This is abusive and bad, and you need to work with your part to contain this behavior. And so we switched to Terry Reel's model, relational life therapy. Terry and Jeff are good friends in the Boston area. My partner was the medical director at Harvard's inpatient psychiatric hospital, and Terry's there, and Terry and Belinda are colleagues and friends. And so Terry referred us to one of the people he had trained, who's a therapist here in the Bay Area. And RLT is really different than IFS, because they absolutely take sides. And I've seen Terry and Dick kind of go at it, with disagreeing with one another. And, Terry is, very strongly feels that when there are power dynamics playing out in a relationship, for example, that the one down person sometimes needs someone to take their side to stand up to the bully. And of course, in our inner world, often that's the case. Self needs to show up for exiled parts to stand up to bullying protectors, without taking sides. So I'm just curious, like, does that come up for you when you're working with individuals? And I don't know if there's like a NARM version of couples therapy or family therapy. But I find those things to be at odds. Like I get Dick's point of view and your point of view, and I get Terry's point of view. And sometimes I don't know how to resolve them when there's more than one client.
Well, it's interesting because it's for the longest time, even though I did lots of couples therapy when I was in private practice, for the longest time, I didn't do any couples work in the teaching. I just focused on the individual. And because there was so much interest in how this works with couples, and I actually loved working with couples, and my approach is quite different in working with couples. I intervene a lot more. It's not the same as when I'm working with an individual. And I will I will seemingly take sides with some parts with one person in the couple versus another, but always keeping in mind that, I'm going to have to address that dynamic with the other.
Yeah.
But there is much more. And I came from that. I came from a background of structural and strategic family therapy, and also some the great family therapists that were out there when I was particularly young psychologist, and they didn't worry about taking sides. They could be very, very confronted with all kinds of things. So I've just been really in the last 6 to 9 months showing more of that, and I'm actually in our inner circle program. I'm going to be working with a couple, and that's the first time that I've had a couple doing it, and explaining the difference, because I do agree with you.
Yeah,
that
right.
You can't take the exact same hands-off approach with a couple that you do with an individual.
Right. Yeah, no, it's, and I've seen Terry do his work, and he's so compassionate when he's calling somebody out. He's doing it. He's really calling them in. He's really enlisting buy-in from their protectors, with the reward, with the kind of the sell of like, hey, if you're willing to stop doing this behavior, guess what? You get love. You get more connection, you get more sex, you get more fun, you get more authenticity, you get more intimacy, more being seen and heard and known for who you are, and happier family, happier children, all of that. So he does a wonderful job. It's not like he's judgy or cruel in any way, but he's definitely firm and direct. And that was really helpful for my partnership. It was, again, because my partner he grew up with a horrible family and then has had horrible relationships. So he had really no model for like, what does it mean to be showing up in a relationship as an equal with another equal person that, he's the two of us both have tended to partner with people that we were sort of the one up, um, more controlling, and to find a way where we're balancing that has been a real beautiful exploration, a real challenge also. But so much of it has just been like relational skill building, like psychoeducation. um, which doesn't do the deep trauma healing work. It doesn't do the inner child work, right? It doesn't do the somatic work, but it does at least start to get cognitive buy-in.
Well, I think anytime people are challenged in a loving way, and out of that, they're able to take ownership of their acting out in whatever ways that's happening, there's an increase of agency. And by whether it's addressed directly or not, there's an increased embodiment, because they're not lost in all of their strategies, as we talk about them in NARM, and they're more present, and then I talk about that as a way of understanding agency, which is an important word in NARM, is that when the couple comes in and they're pointing the finger at each other and blaming and wanting you to take sides, and see how right they are and how wrong their partner is that as long as they're locked into that, the prognosis is not good for that relationship. But as soon as each person, and it all has to start with one, but when one of the members of the couple will start to be a little more vulnerable, take a little bit more, experience a little bit more of their own agency and the difficulties that they're having together, then often you'll see that the partner will settle, and they will then also respond with more vulnerability and, again, more ownership of their part. When that starts to happen, then going from this, very difficult negative cycle, or they move into a virtuous cycle of, opening up, being more vulnerable, which touches the other usually, and then and anytime that people start getting closer and more connected, again, part of the NAR model is that what will surface is all of these any unresolved material that they've been carrying around. And we expect that. So we know that they might get 2 steps closer, and then it gets to be too much for that moment, and they'll act out in some way, and then they may go back into the blaming, but over time, more capacity develops, more vulnerability, more heartfulness with each other, and that in itself is its own reward. They don't need to be told at that point. They could start to experience. Yeah, they're just like you said, they're getting more love, more intimacy, more sex, more touch, more all of the things that human beings tend to want. So, um, yeah, I think we do need 2 different models. I mean, they can exist on a deeper level, from the same model, but 2 different ways, at least, of working with couples versus with individuals.
Well, Larry, you said something that I really want to double click on because I feel like it's so important. You talked about how as people start, and I'm butchering your exact words, but it's like as people start to reconnect, they're met with some of the big feelings or the things that cause them to disconnect in the first place. Can you say more about that? Because that might be counterintuitive for some people. It's like, okay, here I am doing healing work, and now all of a sudden I'm feeling intense rage, or I'm feeling intense grief, or I'm feeling helpless, or, I'm not supposed to be feeling this. I'm supposed to be feeling better. Like, what is that?
You're exactly right. You've identified the ideas that people have. And it depends on how and who is asking, but I will say something like, once you start feeling more, you're going to be we can't be so selective. You're going to open yourself up to feeling all kinds of things that you've maybe been running away from or hiding from or afraid to face. And so we expect that, and that's part of the process. And as that comes up, we'll address those things. So again, in an atmosphere of normalizing it and making it okay and making it, which it is, it's inevitable. As we get more connected, and these challenges come up, and that was a section in the very first book about where I wrote it. And this is true even for individuals, whether or not, not even separate from couples, is the challenges of reconnection. As soon as we start to feel our emotions, feel our body, be more present with other people, we're starting to face parts of ourselves that we've shut down, that we've disconnected from. And that's difficult sometimes, and we acknowledge that. But just by normalizing it, it's also inevitable, and it's part of the growth process. Most people seem to be able to get that. That doesn't mean that in any given moment when they start, they're not going to have anxiety moments or periods when they want to just disconnect or disappear. And again, but since we hold that bigger picture, we don't see that as anything going wrong. We see it as inevitable. Now, how we work with that as therapists, that's where we could go wrong if we don't know how to address that. Then we could reinforce that strategy or whatever, that reaction that a person is having.
Lissa, since we are coming to a close here, I just want to ask, is there anything we haven't touched on today that you feel like you would really love to address with our viewers and listeners today?
Oh, well, I'm in the second round of edits for my 8th book right now. So that's what's really present with me. In fact, Larry, I'd love to talk with you more about it at some point to get your feedback about it. But my partner, Jeff Rediger, and I are co-writing this book largely because so many of the stories are his. It's called Relation Sick, and it's about the health implications of unbalanced relationships. And we sort of break it down into 4 levels of unbalanced relationship, with level 1 being, for example, a caregiver with a disabled partner. It's an unbalanced relationship, but it's not an abusive relationship. It's just that the over giving, the caregiver is often at risk of becoming sick because of, burnout, caregiver burnout. And then level 4 being sort of the sociopath, the malignant narcissist, the unbalanced in that there's coercive control and potentially criminal activities such as domestic violence or con artist fraud, theft, things like that. With level 2 being the one that we're mostly looking at, which is sort of your garden variety, narcissist, codependent, or maybe we'd call it in NARM, the trust survival style with the attunement survival style. I think those types tend to like each other, but then you can get power dynamics there wherein one person is getting exploited and the other person is the exploiter. And the body, the impact on the body, on the nervous system, on the immune system, on the inflammatory system, on the cardiovascular system, all of that is a significant thing. So that's sort of where I am in my journey, is sort of the relational elements of that, including, we've talked about loneliness and health and trauma as it relates to that kind of loneliness. And I think some of the loneliest people are the people that are in those kinds of relationships. We're sort of previewing that in Love School, in the ongoing IFS community of practice that we have. And we've introduced them to NARM as well, Larry.
Do you want to tell us just a little bit more about Love School?
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite things that I'm doing right now because I'm getting so much out of it. And I get so excited going into it's just a 2-hour Zoom community of practice every other week with, we always do kind of an IFS meditation, work with our parts. We're doing creative prompts and writing and movement and trauma healing, but also sort of relational skill building and kind of deep dives into some of the trauma symptoms that come from relational trauma and it's basically for people with developmental trauma. So it is a developmental trauma program because I'm not aware of many group. I was trying to find something like that specifically for people who were partnering with somebody who had severe trauma. Because that's sort of my role in my relationship. And I found lots of resources for cult survivors, for example, but not for the people that are trying to partner with cult survivors. So we initially were going to make it just for the securely attached partners of people with severe attachment wounding, for example. And then all the people with severe attachment wounding were like, wait, can I please come and learn what my partner's going through, and vice versa. So we ended up accepting both sides of partners. And now we have a lot of single people also who are in recovery from a difficult relationship and wanting to learn these sort of relational skill building tools in order to feel more confident going into a new relationship in the future. Yeah, it's really lovely. They're so sweet. And we're doing peer-to-peer parts processing, sort of teaching them how to partner with each other. So that, because many of them can't afford therapy, they're there because they can't afford a one-on-one therapist. We offer it. Anybody who asks, we offer, pay what you can programs and things. So it's part of my health equity mission, because I hate the fact, this is a part of me, an activist part, that just hates the fact that so much of the healing work that I offer, that I have experienced, that I've had the privilege of having, is we've spent like $100,000 on our treatment between me and my partner. This is a massive luxury good, and I hate that. I hate that we pay $300 a week for our couples therapy, and we paid $300 a week for our individual therapies. And there's so many people that the people who need it the most are the ones who can't access it. So I've also started a nonprofit called Heal at Last. We're still in the developmental phase. We've gotten some grant funding for that. And so Love School is sort of an offshoot of that, sort of a way to start creating communities of healing that are more affordable for the people that can't necessarily afford one-on-one therapy, or are doing this as an adjunct to deepen their experience between therapy.
Thank you so much for both of you. It's just been, I feel very lucky I've gotten to be just almost a fly on the wall in this conversation. It's really...
No, you held the space for us.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you.
You're like the container, not the fly.
I'll take both. Yeah.